The spring sun warmed Special Agent Tanya Mitchell's face through the car window as she drove down the highway. She tapped her fingers on the steering wheel, humming along to the old soul song playing softly on the radio. 10 years with the FBI had taught her to appreciate these quiet moments between cases. She glanced at her watch, 2:30 p.m. Perfect timing. The witness interview had gone better than expected. The nervous bank teller had finally opened up about what he'd seen during the fraud case that had consumed Tanya's team for months. His testimony could be the missing piece they needed. "Got you," she whispered to herself, feeling that familiar rush of satisfaction. She'd scribbled 6 pages of detailed notes that now sat in her leather portfolio on the passenger seat. Tanya rolled her shoulders to release the tension that always built up during intense interviews. Her boss would be pleased with today's progress. Maybe she'd even have time to grab coffee with her sister later if traffic stayed light on the drive back to the field office. The highway stretched before her, surprisingly empty for a Wednesday afternoon. Trees lined both sides of the road, their new green leaves dancing in the breeze. Tanya adjusted her blazer and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, making sure she still looked professional despite the long day. That's when she noticed the flashing lights behind her. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, checking her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. Her turn signals worked fine. What could this be about? Tanya put on her indicator and carefully pulled over to the shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. She took a deep breath and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Despite her position in law enforcement, Tanya never took chances during traffic stops. The police cruiser parked about 15 feet behind her. Through her mirror, she watched a tall officer step out and adjust his hat before approaching. His hand rested casually near his holster, standard procedure, but it still made her stomach tighten slightly. Tanya rolled down her window as the officer reached her car. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice professional but stern. His nameplate read Officer Delaney. He looked to be in his early 30s with sharp eyes that scanned her car interior. "License and registration, please." "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Tanya asked politely. "Your registration tag appears to be expired," he replied, gesturing toward the rear of her car. That couldn't be right. Tanya distinctly remembered renewing her registration last month, but arguing wouldn't help. "Officer, I need to inform you that I'm carrying my service weapon," she said calmly, maintaining eye contact. "I'm a federal agent with the FBI. My credentials and identification are in my bag on the passenger floor." Something changed in Officer Delaney's expression. His posture stiffened, and his hand moved closer to his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he said, his voice now noticeably harder. "Sir, I can show you my FBI credentials." "Ma'am, I need you to exit the vehicle now," he interrupted, taking a step back and partially unsnapping his holster. Tanya felt a familiar heaviness settle in her chest. She'd been here before, though usually as the agent training police departments on proper procedure. Now she was on the receiving end. "I'm going to comply, officer," she said clearly. "I'm opening my door slowly and stepping out." As she emerged from her car, the warm spring day suddenly felt chilly. Officer Delaney instructed her to turn and place her hands on the roof of her vehicle. A passing car slowed down to watch. What had started as a perfect day was quickly becoming something else entirely. As she stood with her hands on her car, Tanya ran through her options. This wasn't just about her anymore. How she handled the next few minutes could have far-reaching consequences. She heard Officer Delaney radio for backup. "Possible impersonation of a federal officer," he said into his shoulder mic. "Subject claims FBI status." Tanya closed her eyes briefly. She knew exactly what she needed to do next. Officer Delaney kept his distance as he watched Tanya, one hand hovering near his holster. Cars whizzed by on the highway, slowing down as drivers rubbernecked to see what was happening. The sun beat down on Tanya's back as she remained still, hands placed firmly on the roof of her car. "I understand this is protocol," Tanya said evenly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "But my credentials are in my bag on the passenger seat. If you'd allow me to show you." "Stay where you are," Officer Delaney cut her off. His eyes darted to her vehicle, then back to her. Anyone can buy a fake badge these days. A bead of sweat trickled down Tanya's temple, not from fear, but from the frustration of the situation. She'd conducted dozens of training sessions on proper field interactions. She'd stood before rooms of officers explaining the importance of following procedure without letting bias cloud judgment. Now here she was, living what she'd only talked about before. The radio on Officer Delaney's shoulder crackled. "Backup is 3 minutes out," came a static-filled voice. Tanya took a slow breath. "Officer, I respect that you're doing your job. But there's been a misunderstanding about my registration. It was renewed last month, and I really am with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If you run my plates properly, you'll see they're registered to a federal vehicle." Delaney's eyebrows furrowed. He seemed to be weighing his options. "Turn around slowly, hands where I can see them," he instructed. Tanya complied, moving with deliberate care. She faced him now, the sun in her eyes making her squint slightly. Traffic continued to slow as more curious drivers passed the scene. "What division of the FBI did you say you work for?" Delaney asked, his tone slightly less harsh but still suspicious. "Financial crimes," Tanya replied. "I was just coming back from interviewing a witness in the Hartford bank fraud case. My supervisor is Special Agent in Charge Richard Cooper. You're welcome to call the field office to verify." A second patrol car pulled up behind Delaney's, lights flashing. The new arrival, an older officer with salt and pepper hair, stepped out and approached cautiously. "What have we got, Jim?" the older officer asked. "Subject claims to be FBI," Delaney responded, not taking his eyes off Tanya. "Says her credentials are in the vehicle." The older officer looked Tanya up and down. 20 years on the force had given him a better sense for reading people. "Ma'am, what's your name and badge number?" "Special Agent Tanya Mitchell, badge number 7336, she answered confidently. "Like I told Officer Delaney, my credentials are in my bag on the passenger seat of my vehicle." The new officer nodded thoughtfully. "Jim, have you run her plates yet?" Delaney hesitated, was about to when you arrived. "Do it now," the older officer said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. As Delaney returned to his cruiser to run her plates, Tanya stood motionless, still keeping her hands visible. The older officer maintained a professional distance, but his stance was noticeably less aggressive. "Been with the Bureau long?" he asked, making conversation but clearly also assessing her responses. 10 years next month, Tanya replied. "Started in New York, transferred here 3 years ago." The officer nodded. "My cousin works private security now, used to be with the U.S. Marshals, says the FBI folks always have the best coffee in their offices." Despite the tension, Tanya felt a small smile form. "That's actually true. We're pretty serious about our coffee." Officer Delaney returned, his face a mixture of confusion and growing concern. He spoke quietly to his colleague, showing him something on his phone. The older officer's eyebrows rose slightly. "Officer Delaney," Tanya said, seizing the moment, "I understand your caution. In your position, I'd be careful too. But I think there's been a mistake about my registration and my identity. If you'll allow me to demonstrate that I am who I say I am, we can clear this up quickly." Delaney looked at her differently now, uncertainty creeping into his expression. The plates had checked out. The vehicle was indeed registered to the FBI field office, but protocol was protocol. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see those credentials," he said, his tone now professional rather than accusatory. "With your permission, I'll retrieve them from your vehicle." Tanya nodded. "The black leather bag on the passenger floor. My badge and ID are in the front pocket." As Delaney cautiously approached her car, Tanya remained still, knowing that what happened in the next few minutes would determine how this story ended. Officer Delaney moved carefully toward Tanya's car, his hand still resting near his weapon. The older officer kept his eyes on Tanya, who remained perfectly still, had hands visible just as she'd been trained to have suspects do countless times before. A truck driver honked as he passed, adding to Tanya's growing headache. The whole situation felt surreal, like she was watching herself in one of the training videos she showed to new agents. Delaney reached through the open window of her car and carefully retrieved the black leather bag. He placed it on the hood of the car and unzipped the front pocket, finding exactly what Tanya had described, an FBI badge and identification card. His expression changed as he examined them, running his thumb over the official seal. These look authentic, he said, his voice carrying a hint of doubt that was rapidly fading. The older officer stepped closer to look. That's the real deal, Jim. Delaney's face flushed slightly as he looked back at Tanya. I need to verify this with your office, Agent Mitchell. Of course, Tanya replied, keeping her voice calm despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. The field office number is listed on my credentials. Ask for Special Agent Cooper, my supervisor. Delaney nodded and walked back to his patrol car, credentials in hand. The older officer stayed with Tanya, his posture more relaxed now. Sorry about this, he said quietly. Better to be thorough than sorry. Tanya gave a small nod but said nothing. Her thoughts raced as she considered what she should do next. File a complaint? Let it go. Use it as a teaching moment? The professional side of her understood the officer's caution. The human side felt humiliated standing on the roadside while curious drivers slowed to stare. 5 minutes passed before Delaney returned, his entire demeanor transformed. He handed back her credentials with notably more respect than he'd shown earlier. I apologize for the confusion, Agent Mitchell, he said formally. Your identity has been confirmed by Agent Cooper. Thank you, officer, Tanya replied, finally lowering her arms. Her shoulders ached from maintaining the same position. May I ask what flagged my registration as expired? It was renewed last month. Delaney shifted uncomfortably. There appears to have been an error in the system. Your registration is actually current. The older officer glanced at his colleague, then back to Tanya. We apologize for the inconvenience, Agent Mitchell. You're free to go. Tanya took her bag and credentials, but she didn't move toward her car. 10 years of FBI training had taught her to recognize important moments when they appeared. This was one of them. Officers, she said, her voice steady and professional, before I go, I'd like to speak with you both privately for a moment. Delaney looked surprised. He probably expected her to leave as quickly as possible, maybe with a threat to call his supervisor. The older officer raised an eyebrow, but nodded. We can step over here, he suggested, gesturing to a spot away from passing traffic. The three moved to the grassy area beyond the shoulder. Tanya could feel her heart pounding. What she was about to do wasn't in any FBI handbook. It was a personal choice, one that might not change anything or might change everything. I want to be clear about something, Tanya began, looking directly at both officers. I'm not filing a complaint about this stop. Relief flashed across Delaney's face, quickly replaced by confusion. But, she continued, I'd like to talk about what just happened here. Not as an FBI agent to police officers, but as three people in law enforcement who all want to do their jobs correctly. The older officer folded his arms, curious. Delaney looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. I train agents on proper field protocols, Tanya explained. I also occasionally work with police departments on federal cases. What happened today is a perfect example of how things can go wrong even when everyone is trying to do the right thing. Delaney's jaw tightened. Agent Mitchell, if you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything yet, Tanya interrupted gently. I'm asking if you'd be willing to have an honest conversation about what just happened and what we might all learn from it. The dash cam is still recording, which is good. I want this on record. The officers exchanged glances. This was not how they expected this traffic stop to end. The afternoon sun beat down on the three of them as they stood in the grass beside the highway. Cars continued to zoom past, drivers no longer slowing down now that the apparent drama had ended. But for Tanya, Officer Delaney, and the older officer, the most important part was just beginning. Look, said Delaney, shifting his weight uncomfortably, I was just following protocol. When someone claims to be law enforcement. Tanya held up a hand. I understand protocol better than most people, Officer Delaney. That's not what I want to discuss. The older officer, whose nameplate read Reynolds, watched the exchange with interest. 45 years of life and 20 on the force had taught him when to listen. When you approached my car, Tanya continued, what did you see first? Before you saw my registration, before you saw my face clearly, what information did you have? Delaney frowned. A sedan with what appeared to be an expired tag. And when you got to my window? A woman claiming to have a weapon and to be FBI. Tanya nodded. Would you have responded the same way if I looked different? Be honest. The cameras are rolling, but this isn't about getting anyone in trouble. It's about learning. A flash of defensiveness crossed Delaney's face. Are you suggesting I stopped you because... I'm not suggesting anything, Tanya interrupted calmly. I'm asking you to think about split-second decisions and what influences them. We all make these decisions, FBI, local police, everyone in law enforcement. Sometimes we don't even realize what's affecting our choices. Officer Reynolds nodded slowly. She's got a point, Jim. Remember that training last year about unconscious biases? Delaney's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Let me walk through what I experienced, Tanya said. I informed you immediately about my service weapon, which is standard procedure. I told you I was FBI. Your response was to escalate the situation rather than to verify my statement. You could have been lying, Delaney said. True, but there were safer ways to verify that. You could have asked me specific questions only an agent would know. You could have called for verification while I remained in my vehicle. Instead, you had me exit and stand exposed on the roadside. A bead of sweat rolled down Delaney's temple. Whether from the heat or discomfort, Tanya couldn't tell. I train people on these scenarios, she continued, her voice softening. And the hardest lesson to teach is how our backgrounds and experiences shape our split-second judgments. I'm not asking if you're biased, Officer Delaney. I'm asking if you've considered how your past experiences might affect your present actions. Reynolds watched his younger colleague with interest. This wasn't the typical angry civilian encounter. This woman was speaking their language, the language of law enforcement, but challenging them in ways they rarely experienced. What would you have done differently? Delaney finally asked, surprising both Tanya and Reynolds. Tanya smiled slightly, the first real smile since being pulled over. I would have maintained distance but requested dispatch contact the FBI field office while I remained in my vehicle. I would have asked questions that a real agent could answer but an impersonator couldn't. Most importantly, I wouldn't have created a potentially dangerous situation for either of us. She gestured to the highway. Out here, exposed, both of us were vulnerable. If I had been a threat, which thankfully I wasn't, this could have ended badly for everyone. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. She's right, Jim. Procedure is important, but so is smart policing. Delaney was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost its defensive edge. So what happens now? Are you going to report this? That depends, Tanya replied. I'm more interested in what we can learn from it. Would you be willing to review the dash cam footage with me? Not as a complaint, but as a training opportunity. The request hung in the air between them. This wasn't how traffic stops usually ended. This wasn't normal procedure for any of them. But something important was happening, something that might matter far beyond this roadside conversation. Officer Delaney stared at Tanya for a long moment. Birds chirped in the trees lining the highway, creating a strange, peaceful backdrop to the tense conversation. Finally, he nodded slowly. Okay, he said, surprising even himself. I'd be willing to review the footage. Officer Reynolds raised his eyebrows but said nothing. In 20 years on the force, he'd never seen an interaction like this one. Thank you, Tanya said. She glanced at her watch. I need to get back to my office, and I know you both have jobs to do. Could we set up a time to meet? Maybe tomorrow or the next day? The station has meeting rooms, Reynolds suggested. Would tomorrow afternoon work? Say around 2 o'clock. Tanya nodded. That would be perfect. She pulled out her card and handed one to each officer. My direct line is on there. Text me if anything changes. As she turned to head back to her car, Officer Delaney cleared his throat. Agent Mitchell, he called. When she turned back, he seemed to be struggling with his words. I just want to say, I'm sorry about how this went down. The apology hung in the air between them. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Thank you, Officer Delaney, Tanya replied. I'll see you both tomorrow. The drive back to the FBI field office gave Tanya plenty of time to think. She replayed the traffic stop in her mind, analyzing every moment. By the time she pulled into the parking garage, she had already begun forming a plan. When she walked into the building, her colleague Tom looked up from his desk. There you are, he called out. Cooper's been asking for you. How'd the interview go? It was productive, Tanya replied, dropping her bag on her desk. but I had an interesting experience on the way back. She filled him in quickly on what had happened. Tom's expression shifted from surprise to anger to disbelief. "You're meeting with them tomorrow?" he asked incredulously. "Why not file a complaint? That's textbook profiling." Tanya sank into her chair. "Maybe. But what would a complaint accomplish? Another officer gets reprimanded, becomes more resentful, and nothing really changes." "So what's your plan?" Tom asked, leaning against her desk. "I'm going to turn it into a teaching moment," she said, opening her laptop. "Remember that training module I've been working on? About law enforcement interactions?" Tom nodded. "The one Cooper keeps pushing back on the budget for." "That's the one," Tanya said, typing quickly. "I think I just found my perfect case study." The next afternoon, Tanya arrived at the police station 15 minutes early. The desk sergeant directed her to a small meeting room where both Officer Delaney and Officer Reynolds were already waiting. A laptop was set up, connected to a small screen on the wall. "Thank you both for agreeing to this," Tanya said as she entered, setting her bag on the table. "Honestly, I was surprised you showed up," Delaney admitted. He looked different in the station, more at ease, but also more vulnerable. "I keep my promises, Officer Delaney," Tanya replied, taking a seat across from them. "Have you reviewed the footage?" Reynolds nodded. "We pulled it this morning. It's queued up and ready." Tanya took a deep breath. "Before we watch it, I want to explain what I hope to accomplish here. This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about recognizing patterns and learning from them." She opened her bag and pulled out a folder. "I've been developing a training program for FBI agents about field interactions. I'd like your permission to use yesterday's incident, with names and faces blurred, of course, as a case study." The officers exchanged glances. "You want to use our mistake as a training tool?" Delaney asked, his voice tight. "Not your mistake," Tanya corrected gently. "Our interaction. There are learning opportunities on both sides here." Reynolds leaned forward, curious. "What kind of learning opportunities?" Tanya smiled. "Let's watch the footage together, and I'll show you exactly what I mean." She pressed play, and the three of them watched in silence as yesterday's events unfolded on screen. What happened next would change all of their careers in ways none of them could have anticipated. The room fell silent as the video played. Watching herself on screen felt strange to Tanya, like seeing a movie where she knew all the lines but couldn't change the script. She glanced occasionally at the officers' faces, noting their reactions. When the footage ended, Officer Delaney sat back in his chair. His face had gone through a series of expressions: defensiveness, discomfort, and finally, something that looked like genuine reflection. "I'd like to break this down step by step," Tanya said, pulling a notepad from her bag. "First, let's talk about the initial approach." She paused the video at the moment Delaney first reached her window. "Notice your hand position here," she pointed out. "It's already near your weapon before I've said anything about being armed." Delaney frowned. "That's standard procedure on traffic stops. Officer safety." "I understand that," Tanya nodded. "But watch what happens when I identify myself as FBI." She played the next 30 seconds, then paused again. "Your hand moves closer to your weapon, your stance widens, and your tone changes completely. My question is, why?" The room fell quiet again. Reynolds shifted in his seat, watching his younger colleague carefully. Delaney began, then stopped. He stared at the frozen image on the screen. "I guess I thought you might be lying." "That's a reasonable concern," Tanya agreed. "But what made you assume I was lying rather than telling the truth?" The question hung in the air. "Look," Reynolds interjected, "we deal with people trying to talk their way out of tickets all the time." "Of course," Tanya said. "But there's a difference between skepticism and immediately escalating a situation. Watch what happens next." She played the footage showing her being ordered out of the car and the arrival of Officer Reynolds. "Now here," she paused the video again. "Officer Reynolds, you take a different approach. You ask questions designed to verify my identity. You maintain a safe distance but don't immediately assume I'm being deceptive." Reynolds nodded slowly. 20 years on the job teaches you to listen first." "Exactly," Tanya said, turning to Delaney. "That's what I want to focus on in my training, the difference between caution and escalation." Delaney's face flushed, but he didn't look away. I see what you're saying. I'm not here to make you feel bad, Tanya assured him. We all make split-second decisions based on limited information. The key is understanding what influences those decisions. She pulled out 3 copies of a document and handed them each one. This is a breakdown of decision points during high-stress interactions. I've used it with new agents for years. The highlighted sections show where small changes in approach can lead to completely different outcomes. Delaney scanned the paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. So you really aren't filing a complaint? He asked, looking up at her. No, Tanya replied. I'm more interested in creating change than in punishing people, which brings me to my proposal. She took a deep breath and continued, I'd like to develop this incident into a training module for both FBI agents and police officers. With your permission, of course. All identities would be protected. Reynolds looked intrigued. A joint training program. Exactly, Tanya nodded. My supervisor has been pushing for better cross-agency training for years. This could be the start of something important. And you want us involved? Delaney asked, surprise evident in his voice. If you're willing, Tanya said, your perspective would be valuable. Officer Reynolds, your experience and de-escalation techniques would be especially helpful to demonstrate. Reynolds sat back, a small smile on his face. Never thought I'd end up teaching FBI agents. And I never thought I'd be using my own traffic stop as a teaching tool, Tanya replied with a smile. Life takes unexpected turns. Delaney had been quiet, still studying the document in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, more thoughtful than defensive. I'd like to be part of it, he said, if you'll have me. Tanya extended her hand across the table. I was hoping you'd say that. As they shook hands, she knew this moment might be the beginning of something far more significant than any of them had anticipated. 3 months later, Tanya stood at the front of a packed training room. 30 police officers and 15 FBI agents filled the seats, their attention focused on the presentation screen behind her. Today we're going to talk about a traffic stop that changed the way I think about law enforcement interactions, she began, her voice carrying confidently through the room. At the back of the room, Officer Reynolds gave her an encouraging nod. Beside him sat Officer Delaney, looking more at ease in this room of mixed law enforcement than anyone might have expected. What began as a routine stop turned into something none of us anticipated, Tanya continued. Before I play the footage, I want to emphasize that this isn't about pointing fingers. It's about recognizing patterns and learning from them. She clicked play, and the now familiar footage began. The faces were blurred, the names removed, but the situation was unmistakable. The room watched in silence as the events unfolded on screen. When it ended, Tanya turned to face her audience. Questions? Observations? A young police officer in the front row raised her hand. The officer moved to escalate very quickly. Why not verify her credentials first? Before Tanya could answer, Delaney stood up from his seat at the back. That's a good question, he said, walking to the front of the room. Mind if I take this one, Agent Mitchell? Tanya smiled and gestured for him to continue. I was that officer, Delaney said simply. The room fell completely silent. And the truth is, I made assumptions based on limited information. I let past experiences cloud my judgment instead of following the best protocol. A murmur ran through the room. The easy thing would have been for Agent Mitchell to file a complaint and move on, Delaney continued. The hard thing was what she actually did, turn a negative experience into a learning opportunity for all of us. An FBI agent in the middle row spoke up. How has this changed your approach to traffic stops? Completely, Delaney answered honestly. I've started asking myself one simple question before I react. What am I assuming right now and why? That pause has made all the difference. The training session continued for another hour, with Tanya, Delaney, and Reynolds taking turns explaining different aspects of the case study. The questions were thoughtful, the discussions productive. By the end, business cards were being exchanged between agencies that had rarely collaborated before. As the room cleared out, Tanya's supervisor approached her. The chief wants to expand this program to every precinct in the county, he told her. And there's talk of taking it statewide. Tanya nodded, watching as Delaney chatted easily with a group of FBI agents across the room. It's a start. More than a start, her supervisor corrected. This is the most productive cross-agency collaboration I've seen in 25 years. You've built something important here. Later, as Tanya packed up her materials, Delaney approached. Just wanted to say thanks, he said. Not many people would have done what you did. Turned a traffic stop into a career-defining moment, Tanya joked. Given someone a second chance, Delaney replied seriously. You could have made me a villain in this story. Instead, you made me a partner. Tanya shook her head. You made yourself a partner when you were willing to look honestly at what happened that day. As they walked out to the parking lot together, Reynolds joined them, keys jingling in his hand. My wife wants to know if you're coming to dinner next Sunday, he said to Tanya. She's making her famous apple pie. Wouldn't miss it, Tanya replied with a smile. What had started as a tense roadside confrontation had transformed into something none of them could have predicted, not just a training program, but a genuine friendship and partnership that crossed the traditional boundaries between agencies. As Tanya drove home that evening, she thought about the unexpected paths life sometimes takes. One moment had changed 3 careers and would potentially impact thousands of officers and agents, all because she had chosen education over anger, connection over conflict. Sometimes the most powerful response to being misjudged isn't outrage, it's understanding.